The first-class cabin smelled of leather and money. It always did. A blend of aged whiskey, finely polished seats, and the faintest hint of expensive cologne lingered in the air, an unspoken reminder that this was a place for those who had arrived, at least in the financial sense. Soft conversations hummed in the background, accompanied by the occasional clink of a champagne glass. Overhead, bins clicked shut as passengers settled in, adjusting designer bags and expensive watches, slipping off their tailored jackets, and exchanging the kind of small talk that came naturally to those who had long stopped worrying about the price of things. Nathan Kessler barely glanced up from his phone as he dropped into seat 3A, a window seat, exactly how he liked it. He had no interest in idle chatter, no patience for forced pleasantries. He was a man who valued efficiency, whether it was in business, conversation, or the way he traveled. He exuded the kind of confidence that came from years of closing deals and sitting in boardrooms where people laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny. It wasn't just money that gave him this air of self-assurance. It was power. The kind of power that made people return his calls within minutes, that got him reservations at the best restaurants with a single text, that ensured the world revolved just enough in his favor to keep him satisfied. He ordered a scotch before takeoff, loosening his tie as if to silently declare to everyone that he was the kind of man who belonged in first class, a self-made success, a man who had earned his place. The flight from Dallas to Tampa was just under 3 hours. Not long, but long enough to enjoy the perks of luxury travel. Long enough to relax, sip his drink, and assess his surroundings. Long enough to remind himself why he always flew first class, why he never settled for less. He had no intention of working, not when there were premium drinks and the opportunity to size up the cabin. It was a habit of his, observing the people around him, categorizing them, assessing who was worthy of his attention and who wasn't. That's when he noticed her. A blonde woman sat just a few rows ahead, her profile partially visible as she scrolled through something on her iPad. There was something about her, something familiar, but not enough to place. Maybe she was a local news anchor, a C-list actress, someone who'd had her 15 minutes and was desperately clinging to the last few seconds. He smirked, nudging the man in the seat next to him, a mild-mannered traveler who had the misfortune of sitting beside someone who loved the sound of his own voice. Ever notice how some people think money can buy class? Nathan mused, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The man beside him gave a polite, non-committal chuckle, keeping his eyes on the in-flight magazine. He wasn't interested in conversation. But Nathan didn't need an audience to keep talking. "She looks familiar," he went on, tilting his head. "Probably some reality TV reject. You know the type. Big hair, expensive handbag, and no idea how to blend in." His words floated into the space around him, catching the ears of those nearby. A few glanced in his direction, but the woman remained focused on her iPad, either unaware or uninterested in his commentary. That didn't sit well with him. People like her were supposed to care what men like him thought. The plane began taxiing, and the flight attendant made her final rounds, checking seat belts and collecting empty glasses. Nathan leaned back, stretching slightly, already bored with the flight before it had even begun. He watched as the blonde woman politely handed off her drink and smiled at the attendant, her posture composed, her demeanor calm. It irritated him. There was a quiet confidence about her, an ease that suggested she wasn't the kind of woman who would be rattled by side comments or sideways glances. And that made Nathan double down. "I bet she married rich," he muttered, his voice laced with amusement. "You can always tell they wear wealth like a costume, but it never quite fits." The man next to him shifted uncomfortably, clearly hoping to avoid further engagement. Nathan, however, wasn't done. He was used to being the center of attention, to his words carrying weight, to people responding. But this woman, whoever she was, hadn't even acknowledged his existence. That was a problem. He took another sip of scotch, letting the warmth of the liquor fuel his curiosity. Who was she? And why did she seem so unaffected? Nathan prided himself on reading people. It was, in his opinion, one of his greatest skills. He could spot desperation a mile away, sense insecurity in a heartbeat. And yet, as he studied the blonde woman in front of him, he found nothing of the sort. Her movements were effortless. No exaggerated gestures, no performative elegance. Just a woman who looked as though she belonged exactly where she was. And that made him want to know more. The seatbelt sign dinged, and the plane lifted smoothly into the air. The hum of conversation resumed, first in quiet murmurs, then in comfortable chatter. Nathan watched as the blonde woman adjusted her iPad slightly, angling it away from prying eyes. Whatever she was reading or writing, she wasn't eager to share. That only intrigued him more. He shifted in his seat, drumming his fingers lightly against the armrest. Was she ignoring him on purpose? Or was she genuinely unaware of his presence? Either way, it was unacceptable. He leaned forward slightly, raising his voice just enough. "I wonder what the going rate is these days," he paused, letting the words hang in the air. "For a woman to look like that." This time, there was no polite chuckle from his seatmate. The man stiffened, his discomfort palpable. Nathan didn't care. He wasn't looking for approval. He was looking for a reaction. And he finally got one. The blonde woman turned her head slightly, just enough for him to see her full profile. And in that moment, Nathan Kessler realized he had made a mistake. His smirk faltered. His confidence wavered, just for a second, because he knew exactly who she was, and she was nothing like what he had assumed. His grip tightened around his glass, the ice shifting against the amber liquid. Suddenly, the flight to Tampa felt much longer than 3 hours. Nathan had spent years believing he could read people with ease. But today, for the first time in a long time, he had been completely, utterly wrong. Nathan shifted slightly in his seat, ensuring his voice carried just enough to reach unintended ears. "She must have married well," he mused, shaking his head with the kind of knowing amusement reserved for men who believed they understood the world better than it understood them. That's usually how these stories go. Third husband, maybe fourth. Plastic surgeons on speed dial. It's always the same. The air in the cabin shifted, almost imperceptibly, at first. The businessman across the aisle, a silver-haired man in a tailored navy suit, flicked a glance in Nathan's direction. Brief, but weighted. The flight attendant, gracefully making her rounds, hesitated for half a beat as she passed, as if debating whether it was worth the effort to step in. Even the man next to him, who had thus far been perfecting the art of pretending he wasn't in this conversation, exhaled quietly, his fingers tightening slightly around the edges of his open book. A wish, perhaps, to disappear into its pages entirely. Nathan, of course, noticed none of this. Or if he did, he simply didn't care. He lifted his glass, swirled the last of his scotch, and took a slow sip as the plane climbed to cruising altitude. 3 hours. Plenty of time to entertain himself. And if the blonde a few rows ahead refused to acknowledge his presence, well, that only made things more interesting. He wasn't the kind of man who let things go, especially not when he felt ignored. The woman, whoever she was, had yet to look his way. Not even a flicker of recognition, not a twitch of irritation, not the smallest indication that she had heard a single word of his offhand remarks. That didn't sit right with him, so he leaned in. The moment the seatbelt sign blinked off, he lifted his hand in an exaggerated wave, catching the attention of a passing flight attendant. The gesture was deliberate, the kind of entitled motion that suggested he expected immediate service, as if he were in a 5-star restaurant rather than a first-class cabin. "Another scotch," he said smoothly, extending his empty glass. Then, as if just remembering his audience, he tipped his chin toward the blonde woman. "And whatever she's having, too. On me." A test, a challenge wrapped in the guise of a generous offer. Maybe she'd roll her eyes, maybe she'd play along, maybe she'd toss back some quip that would keep him entertained until touchdown, because, of course, women like her loved attention. At least that's what he assumed. But the flight attendant didn't blink, didn't hesitate, didn't give him the satisfaction of a raised brow or a knowing smirk. "She's fine, sir," she said simply, taking his glass and moving away before he could push the matter further. Nathan chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. So, she was one of those. The kind of woman who carried herself like she was untouchable, who acted as if the world, as if men like him, were beneath her notice. That only made it more amusing. Turning back to his seatmate, Nathan tapped the armrest between them, grinning as if sharing some grand inside joke. "You ever notice that?" he said conversationally, as though they had been mid-discussion this whole time. "How some people walk around like they're the main character in life, like the rest of us are just extras in their little movie?" The man beside Nathan gave him a quick glance before returning to his book, making it clear he had no interest in engaging. But that didn't deter Nathan. If anything, it only fueled him. He thrived on reactions, on the satisfaction of knowing his words had an impact, whether good or bad. He leaned back in his seat, swirling the last remnants of his scotch in the glass, his smirk widening. He wasn't done yet. "Haven't really thought about it," the man had said. What a waste. Nathan, however, had thought about it. A lot. And he wasn't going to keep those thoughts to himself. "I'll tell you exactly who she is," he continued, his voice perfectly calculated, not quite loud enough to be outright offensive, but just enough to ensure it carried through the cabin. He knew how to toe the line, how to sound like he was making an observation rather than picking a fight. She's the kind of woman who gets by on her last name, on favors, some senator's ex-wife maybe, or one of those lawyers who loves the camera but couldn't win a case to save her life. The words hovered in the air, waiting, teasing. A well-placed comment was like setting bait. Now he just had to watch and see if she'd bite. Nothing. The blonde woman remained as she was, her fingers gliding across her tablet screen as if she hadn't heard a single word. She didn't fidget, didn't stiffen, didn't even roll her eyes in irritation. It was almost infuriating. Nathan exhaled sharply through his nose, shifting in his seat. His fingers drummed against the armrest as he adjusted his expensive watch, more out of frustration than necessity. this wasn't fun anymore. Not even a glance, he muttered under his breath, though still loud enough for those around him to hear. Guess she's too important for the rest of us. From a few rows back, a woman in a tailored navy pantsuit exchanged a glance with her seatmate, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Across the aisle, an older gentleman peered over his newspaper, one eyebrow slightly raised. People were noticing. But Nathan, ever blind to his own arrogance, assumed they were on his side. He imagined they saw the same thing he did. A woman too wrapped up in her own self-importance, too entitled to acknowledge the people around her. And that was all the encouragement he needed to keep going. He leaned forward slightly, his elbow resting against the armrest, lowering his voice just enough to mimic a shared secret. Mark my words, he said, smirking. She's going to post something later about how exhausting travel is. Probably complain about manspreading or some nonsense. Women like her love playing the victim. But I guarantee you... Excuse me, sir. It was a simple statement, said in a tone neither aggressive nor timid. A voice that cut through the space between them like a clean, precise blade. Nathan turned his head, fully expecting to see the flight attendant standing there, ready to reprimand him for speaking too loudly or causing a disturbance. He was already crafting his defense, already preparing to brush it off with charm and practiced indifference. But when he turned, it wasn't a flight attendant at all. It was her, the blonde woman. For the first time since boarding, she had turned to face him completely. Her expression was unreadable. No anger, no irritation, no signs that he had successfully rattled her. Just a look, a quiet, measured look that did something Nathan hadn't anticipated. It made him aware of himself. He suddenly noticed the way his own voice had carried, how the eyes of the other passengers weren't on her, but on him. Not in solidarity, not in amusement, but in quiet judgment. He felt the weight of that gaze in a way he hadn't before, and yet he shook it off. He met her eyes, waiting for her to say something, to scold him, to argue with him, to react in any way that would justify the way he had spent the last 20 minutes of this flight. But she didn't. She only studied him for a beat longer, as if taking in every inch of who he was, and deciding in real time that he wasn't worth the energy. Then, just as easily as she had turned toward him, she turned back to her tablet, dismissing him entirely. And for the first time in years, perhaps the first time ever, Nathan felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Small.